Only after 2 iterations we realized how much vocabulary precision influences the IELTS writing score. It's not just about knowing more words, it's about using the right word in the right context, especially when you're aiming for Band 7 or higher.
That's true, but I wonder, can vocabulary alone really push someone over the Band 7 threshold? Examiners also look for coherence and grammatical accuracy, so I'm skeptical that word choice is the single biggest factor.
Last week, we got stuck on the word significant in a practice essay. Our teacher pointed out that repeating it 3 times actually lowered the impression of range, even though it's an academic word.
Here's the takeaway. Examiners want to see you paraphrase and demonstrate flexibility. For example, in the speaking section, using phrases like a considerable impact or a major influence instead of repeating significant shows you can handle topic-specific vocabulary.
According to the official IELTS band descriptors, Band 7 requires a sufficient range of vocabulary to allow some flexibility and precision. That means you can't just memorize lists you have to show, you can adapt your language to the question.
But what about listening and reading? I always thought vocabulary mattered less there, since you're just answering questions.
Actually, vocabulary is crucial in those sections too. Many questions test your ability to recognize paraphrased information or synonyms. If you miss a keyword swap, you might misunderstand the whole passage. Only after 2 iterations, we realized how much weight the IELTS puts on less common lexical items, and that's where most candidates stumble, especially moving from Band 6.5 to 7.
That's true. The descriptors specifically mention flexibility and precision in word choice for Band 7. For example, using mitigate instead of reduce in an essay about pollution can make a difference, but only if it's used accurately.
But what if someone tries to use advanced vocabulary and gets the collocation wrong? Like saying make a research instead of do research.
That's exactly the risk. Examiners look for natural collocation, not just big words. Misusing phrases can actually lower your score, even if the vocabulary seems impressive.
And it's not just about avoiding mistakes. For Band 7, the descriptors expect some awareness of style and collocation. That means knowing when a word is formal, informal, or academic context matters.
So, is it better to play it safe with simpler words? Or try for those less common ones, even if you're unsure?
Here's the takeaway. Aim for variety, but only use words and phrases you're confident about. Practice with feedback helps you spot which expressions sound natural and which don't. Only after 2 iterations, we realized how often the environment theme pops up in IELTS reading and writing tasks. It's not just about knowing pollution or climate change. It's about using word families like sustainable, conservation, and collocations such as renewable energy sources.
That's true, but I partly agree because students sometimes overfocus on specialized terms. For example, memorizing photosynthesis might not help as much as mastering high-frequency words like impact, increase, or trend, which appear across multiple themes.
Can you explain that in more detail? Like, should someone spend more time on general words that fit any topic? Or is it better to learn specific vocabulary for each theme?
If you look at IELTS band descriptors, lexical resource is about both range and accuracy. So, prioritizing general academic words, think significant, factor, challenge, gives you flexibility. But for top scores, you still need some theme-specific terms, like curriculum for education or innovation for technology.
Here's the takeaway. Balance is key. Build a solid base of general academic vocabulary, then layer in topic, specific words for common themes. And always practice collocations, phrases like public health concern or technological advancement, because they sound more natural and score higher.
I notice students sometimes mix up words, like using disease when they mean illness, or confusing develop with improve. Are there any quick tips to avoid those mistakes?
One practical method is to keep a vocabulary journal, but organize it by theme and by word family. For instance, under health, group illness, disease, condition, and note their typical uses. Reviewing real IELTS sample answers also helps spot common collocations and avoid missteps.
Only after 2 iterations, we realized how often candidates repeat the same word in their essays, missing out on easy points for lexical resource.
That's right. In fact, the IELTS public band descriptors specifically mention variety of vocabulary as a Band 7 requirement. If someone keeps using important over and over, it signals limited range.
But what if you use a synonym that's a little off, like swapping important for critical, even when it doesn't quite fit?
That's a common pitfall. For example, in a model essay, important can sometimes be replaced with significant or essential, but critical might sound too strong in some contexts. The key is matching the nuance.
Here's the takeaway. Paraphrasing isn't just about swapping words. It's about expressing the same idea accurately. Overusing memorized synonyms can actually lower your score if the meaning shifts or the phrasing becomes awkward.
So, would it help to practice with real sentences? Like, take a sample answer and try rewriting each sentence with at least one synonym?
Absolutely, but always double-check the meaning. For instance, children benefit from sports could become youngsters gain advantages from athletics, but offspring profit from games would sound unnatural.
If you're aiming for band 7 or above, focus on flexibility and precision. Don't just memorize lists, experiment, get feedback, and notice how model answers paraphrase ideas without distorting them. Only after 2 iterations, we realized that memorizing word lists barely moved the needle for our students aiming for band 7. The real progress came when they started using new vocabulary in their own sentences.
That's backed up by research. Active recall and spaced repetition boost retention far more than passive review. For example, using digital flashcard apps with spaced intervals can double the likelihood of remembering a word after a month.
But what if you keep forgetting words even with flashcards? Sometimes I remember a word for a test, but then it just disappears when I try to use it in conversation.
Here's the takeaway. Context is everything. If you only see a word in isolation, it won't stick. Writing short stories or journal entries forces you to connect new vocabulary to real experiences.
I partly agree, but there's a risk of using words incorrectly if you don't check examples. That's why I recommend keeping a vocabulary notebook not just with definitions, but with sample sentences from authentic sources.
Can you explain that in more detail? Like, do you mean copying sentences from books or making up your own?
Both help, but copying real sentences first gives you a model. Then, once you're confident, try creating your own. Studies show that learners who do this are less likely to misuse advanced words.
And don't underestimate the power of wide reading. Exposure to varied contexts, news articles, podcasts, even subtitles builds intuition for when and how to use sophisticated vocabulary. Only after 2 iterations, we realized how much make a decision sounds more natural than do a decision. That subtle difference can really set someone apart in the IELTS speaking test.
Absolutely. Examiners actually listen for these combinations. For example, in the IELTS writing task 2, using take responsibility instead of accept responsibility can show you're comfortable with native-like phrasing.
But what if you memorize a list of collocations and just try to use them all? Isn't there a risk of sounding forced or even making mistakes?
That's a real danger. If you force a collocation into the wrong context, it stands out. For instance, strong rain isn't natural. Native speakers say heavy rain. Context matters as much as the phrase itself.
Here's the takeaway. Building a bank of collocations is useful, but only if you learn them in context. Reading model essays or listening to native speakers helps you see how these word pairs actually work.
So, is it better to focus on a few high-frequency collocations for each IELTS topic, rather than trying to memorize dozens?
Exactly. Research shows that advanced candidates use fewer but more accurate collocations. For example, reach a conclusion or pose a threat. These are common in academic writing and speaking.
And if you're aiming for band 7 or above, using the right collocation at the right moment can be the difference maker. It's about sounding natural, not robotic. Only after 2 iterations, we realized that using words like phenomenon or trend in IELTS essays isn't enough to stand out. What really makes a difference is when candidates use precise terms, like carbon emissions for environment topics or income disparity for social issues.
That's true, but I've seen candidates try to force in advanced words and end up misusing them. For example, someone wrote photosynthesis when describing city pollution, which doesn't fit. Isn't it riskier to use unfamiliar vocabulary just to sound impressive?
Can you explain that in more detail? Like, how do you know if a word is really topic-specific or just a fancy synonym?
Great question. Topic-specific words are those you'd expect experts or professionals to use in that field. For instance, in a health essay, cardiovascular disease is more precise than just illness. But if you use mitochondria without context, it sounds forced.
And accuracy matters more than complexity. According to IELTS band descriptors, using less common vocabulary accurately is what gets you a higher score, not just stringing together big words.
Last week, we got stuck on the word infrastructure. I thought it just meant buildings, but it actually covers transport, energy, and even digital networks. So, learning the real scope of these words helps avoid mistakes.
Here's the takeaway. Build your vocabulary around real IELTS themes like environment, education, or technology, and practice using those words in context, not isolation. Only after 2 iterations of reviewing sample IELTS responses did I realize how much idiomatic language can shift a candidate's score, sometimes up, sometimes down.
That's true. According to examiner reports, using idioms like hit the nail on the head can show natural fluency, but if it sounds forced or is used incorrectly, it actually signals memorization and can lower your score.
But what if someone just loves idioms and uses them all the time? Would that always be a problem? Or does it depend on the context?
Here's the takeaway. In speaking, idioms can enhance your score if they fit naturally and are accurate. But in writing task 2, especially informal expressions like over the moon are usually considered too casual and can hurt coherence.
Exactly. The band descriptors for writing mention less common lexical items, but they don't reward slang or cliches. For instance, a double-edged sword is generally acceptable, but spill the beans is too informal for an academic essay.
So, if I'm not sure whether an idiom is formal enough, should I just avoid it in writing task 2?
If there's any doubt, it's safer to use precise, topic-specific vocabulary. Idioms should never replace clear argumentation or evidence.
One examiner even noted that overusing idioms can make a response sound unnatural, which actually lowers the fluency score. Balance is key.
Only after 2 iterations, we realized how often candidates confuse economic with economical. That subtle difference can really undermine an otherwise strong answer.
Absolutely. I've seen scripts where someone writes, "The government should make economic cars" when they mean economical. It's a classic example of a translation trap directly mapping words from your first language without checking the context.
Can you explain that in more detail? I always thought those 2 words were almost the same, but now I'm not so sure.
Sure, economic relates to the economy or finances in general, while economical means something saves money or resources. So a policy can be economic, but a car that uses less fuel is economical.
Here's the takeaway. Before using a new word, check 2 real IELTS examples and see how it's used in context. That's the fastest way to avoid these mix-ups.
I partly agree, but what about words like affect and effect? Even after checking, I still get confused.
That's a common one. Affect is usually a verb, the weather can affect your mood. Affect is a noun, the effect of pollution is serious. If you're unsure, try swapping in another verb or noun to test the sentence.
And don't forget, overusing basic words like good or bad can cap your score at band 6. Try alternatives like beneficial, detrimental, or advantageous, but only if you're confident about their meaning. Only after 2 iterations we realized that recording yourself isn't just about catching pronunciation slips, it actually exposes gaps in your vocabulary range, especially under time pressure.
That's true, and when candidates listen back, they often notice repeated reliance on basic words. For band 7 or higher, IELTS examiners expect less repetition and more precise word choices. According to the public band descriptors, lexical resource is a key criterion.
But what if you feel stuck using the same words? Is peer feedback really enough to spot those patterns? Or do you need something more objective?
Peer feedback helps, but it's rarely systematic. Using sample IELTS marking criteria as a checklist forces you to judge both range and accuracy. For example, can you use less common collocations naturally, or do you hesitate?
And tracking progress matters. Some learners keep a log of new words they've used spontaneously in practice answers. If you can't recall using a word in context, it's probably not active yet.
So, would you say self-assessment is mostly about honesty? Because sometimes I think I know a word, but in exam conditions, it just disappears.
Here's the takeaway. If you can use new vocabulary without pausing or self-correcting, you're closer to Band 7 readiness. Otherwise, identify those persistent gaps and target them in your next practice round.
Only after 2 iterations, we realized that setting smaller, weekly vocabulary targets made the process much less overwhelming for our learners.
Here's the takeaway. Celebrating those mini milestones like mastering 10 new words in a week can actually boost your motivation and help you stick with it long term.
Can I ask, what if someone feels stuck? Like they're not making progress even after all that effort? Because I've definitely hit that wall before.
That plateau is common. Research shows that switching up your routine, like trying word games or joining a vocabulary challenge, can re-engage your brain and break through that stagnation.
And don't underestimate the power of social learning. Sharing new words with friends or in a study group often leads to better retention and keeps things lively.
I love that. Sometimes I doodle or make silly sentences with new words, and it makes everything feel less like homework.
Exactly, creative activities not only make learning fun, but studies indicate they help anchor vocabulary in your memory.
No matter where you are on your vocabulary journey, remember, progress isn't always linear, but every step counts. Keep your goals realistic, celebrate your wins, and stay curious. Your Band 7 Plus vocabulary is absolutely within reach.